Was a dead body disposed of at sea?
Okay, so the disposal of a dead body is one of the really interesting differences between death on land and death at sea, because the disposal of a dead body at sea has a lot of similarities with the disposal of a body on land, but there are some really interesting points of difference as well, which are kind of a consequence, if you will, of the very unusual nature of burial at sea. So when someone dies, the body is prepared, and this takes a fairly traditional form in the period. The body, if there's time, will be washed and cleaned, usually by members of the dead person's close community. And that, again, is quite a traditional aspect of people's preparations for death on land and at sea. After that, the body will then be kind of enshrouded, usually with the assistance of a sailmaker, and they will sew the body into essentially like a big wrapping or a shroud made of canvas. And this is the really interesting point where the kind of the final stitch comes in, which is the slightly issue of whether or not the very final most stitch on the shroud passes through the nose of the deceased. I've never actually come across any evidence for that in the 18th century. I've heard of cases from the 19th century where allegedly that happened. I can see the merit of such an action potentially because it's a way maybe of checking that the dead person is really dead. But then I've also encountered sources from the 17th and 18th century where people were quite clearly alive, who kind of at the very last minute kind of announced that they were, that they were actually not dead. So they clearly hadn't had this done to them. So I think maybe it's one of those myths. But I think what it encapsulates is that moment of closing up, that moment of sealing off. And of course, when you're being buried at sea, unless you're a very high status member of the crew, the likelihood is that you will be buried and shrouded in canvas. And that's quite a difference to a land burial in this period, where people would expect in the 18th century, the late 17th century even, to be buried within a coffin. So you'd be in the kind of cozy, very concealing confines of a wooden coffin. But at sea, you're wrapped in the shroud. And of course, when you're wrapped in the shroud, you have some shot placed in there as well. That very practically is to ensure that the body sinks and goes to the ocean floor. So at that point, you've kind of prepared the body. You've got it ready, you've got the shot in, you've got it sealed up. The hope is that this is going to be enough to ensure that you kind of maintain the dignity of the body and that everything stays intact and sinks out of sight. When the funeral happens,
Can I just come in there?
Oh,
That's an
yes.
interesting point. Why did it matter that everything was out of sight? Why did they have to sink to the ocean floor?
It's quite, in a way, it seems to be a fairly important aspect of ensuring that there is separation between the dead and the living, and the hope that by placing the body into the sea, weighted and allowing it to sink all the way to the bottom, it won't float. It won't kind of exist anywhere on the surface. It won't return to the surface, because there is this fear, you see, that accompanies burial at sea, that if it's not conducted properly, there may be supernatural consequences, that there may be risks faced by the members of the crew for improperly burying a member of their community. And it's quite interesting because when we see examples of sea burial where it goes wrong, that moment where the body lingers on the surface is viewed rather negatively. It's viewed as being a rather unpleasant or kind of confrontational moment between the dead body and the crew, where they're kind of faced with their own failure to dispose of it properly, to create that boundary between them. Because boundaries in the 18th century are quite important, and the 17th too. The idea that once the dead body is buried, that it's separated from the living. Now, that's very easy to achieve in a land burial, because the coffinated body is placed in the ground and earth is placed on top of it, and that kind of boundary between the living and the dead is closed. At sea, it's far harder, it's far less certain, because the sea itself has a degree of liminality to it. It's kind of a permeable space where things can go in and come back out again. So by hoping to ensure that that body sinks all the way down, you can do as much as you possibly can to ensure that separation. There's a really interesting account from a Dutch traveller who sailed with the Dutch East India Company. And what was quite interesting about his experience was that he witnessed a sea burial where things did go rather wrong. And the body, once it was kind of tossed into the sea, lowered into the sea, if you will, didn't sink, it floats. And when it floats, the members of the crew who are with him watch the body and they start to discuss what the body's doing. They become rather curious about whether or not the body is continually facing east when it floats in the water, with the sense that maybe bodies placed in the sea kind of almost instinctively face towards the east, as in an appropriate Christian burial. What's really interesting about that is their curiosity reaches the level of some of them kind of taking a pole and poking the body to see how it moves and to see whether it corrects its course and then floats with its head facing towards the east again. I think this is really interesting because it highlights two things. One, this sense that the sea is an unusual space and that we can view the sea unfavorably as a permeable and dangerous place where the living can be attacked by the dead who can't be kind of kept from them. But we can also view the sea as essentially a sort of enormous burial ground where the souls of the dead can, live across an enormous space, uncontained by soil. So maybe it's this kind of idealized burial space. But I think more curiously, the sense that these men can tell where the head of the body is gives a sense that when you've got this enshrouded body, you can still kind of discern the human form. It still has a level of humanity to it that a body in a coffin doesn't have. A body in a coffin has a sort of avatar-like quality where it's kind of reduced to the very inhuman form of the coffin. And that kind of becomes the closest we get to contact with the dead individual. But with this enshrouded corpse, people can see where the head is and they can start to think about it as still existing as a body. And I think it's quite a sort of macabrely curious thing that these people on the ship are starting to think about, what it's doing and what that means. And in a way, because they're interacting with this pole and sort of prodding it, they haven't quite separated themselves from it as a member of their crew. They haven't quite released it to the deep. It kind of lingers there uncertainly.
It's interesting because you could quite easily turn a human-shaped body wrapped in a sail into a non-human shaped body wrapped in a sail by stuffing it with stuff or putting some planks in. You definitely could make it more coffin-like, but they obviously chose not to do that, which is quite an interesting point.
Well, there are. It's interesting. There are some accounts of people trying to do that, trying to kind of stuff other items in to sort of confuse the form of the body. But I think for the most part, what we're encountering is a body which is quite similar to the sort of the pre-coffin burial forms, where certainly in the medieval and the early modern, sort of into the 17th century at the beginning, you have those enshrouded burials on land where it's quite clear that there is a human form being buried in the ground. And that kind of keeps people closer to the presence of the dead alongside them. Now it's interesting because, of course, when we have that moment of burial, the moment of burial has a ceremony around it which assumes quite a similar form to the land-based funeral. So, when we're thinking about all these differences between burial at sea and burial on land, the actual funeral service itself has a lot of similarities. There's an encounter between the individual assuming the role of minister and the corpse, as you would have at the entrance to the churchyard. You have that moment where the people are summoned by bells or guns. And again, that's quite similar to how the tolling of the bell in the land-based funeral calls those people to the service and marks that moment of the funeral's beginning and kind of the separation between the moment before the funeral and the time of the funeral and then the moment after the funeral again. That way of kind of creating different boundaries between the living and the dead. And then again, we have the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer, the reading that you use for a sea burial is almost identical to the land burial. except when it talks about, you know, placing the dead into the ground. Here you have a placing the dead into the sea, and the sense that this individual will, much as the dead go into the land until the day of judgment, this individual will go into the sea until the day when the dead are called from the sea at the last judgment. So it tries to create these kind of curious similarities at the same time between land burial and sea burial. And I think it's an interesting way of, maybe in some rather distant ways, kind of trying to organize and order that moment of burial to give it a sense of form and structure. Even if some of the events before that, you know, before the burial and indeed after the burial, can be very uncertain. And those are the moments where we see folklore kind of creeping in, and this, you know, this sense of creating those boundaries, the penalties for not creating those boundaries, and the other things that attend that.